You're watching this video because you want to know about designing for accessibility, and I'll tell you that. But in the end, we're not going to address the blind, the elderly, or any other specific group, but everyone. Today, we're going to cover all these topics. Hopefully, the order will make perfect sense once we're done, and you'll see not just how to strictly be in compliance as a digital public accommodation, but why it's important, and tactics to design to avoid problems. Since I'm not sure who I'm talking to, and we can't go out for a beer afterwards or you can't see me, I'll introduce myself. I'm old. Well, I feel that way. Because years after I got into being a web developer, DBA, and once we invented the term, a UX designer, I did things like this. I've been doing what we now call UX work since 1996, and mobile design since 1999, at least. Yes, there were good, worthy interfaces used by billions of people long before the iPhone. There's absolutely opportunity galore today, but I got in at a fun time and got early on to design the first Google mobile search, work on the first music phone in the world, along with its accompanying music and app store, before anyone else had one we could just copy, or even know to call it an app store. Since then, I've worked for a lot of people. I've worked on phones and embedded software for telecoms, service providers, and phone makers. I have helped build mobile sites such as weather.com and apps for companies like Hallmark, US Bank, and Cummins. I've designed, at least in part, 5 mobile browsers. And you aren't the first people I'm sharing my information with. I've been gathering and analyzing all this for years. Much of what I'm going to say today comes not just from rote repetition of government regulations, research, or from the awesomeness and successes I have had, but from the failures, sometimes quite bad failures. This is why I share the information. We already know stuff that needs to be passed along and shared to make sure we're all doing the best possible job designing for our users and clients, not to mention in some cases avoiding lawyers and courts. I do this all formally. I regularly write for UX Matters, have written for many others like UX Magazine, and have been printed in ACM Interactions. I wrote a whole book on mobile design patterns, and have contributed to or edited other books. But on to the meat of the topic. We generally define accessibility as providing access and functionality for those with a physical or cognitive limit. People other than that are what are generally called the able-bodied. Who is disabled? Well, as it turns out, kind of everyone. Around 15% of the world's population, or an estimated 1 billion people, are currently living with a disability. That makes it the world's largest minority by far. If you need more manageable numbers, or just don't care about the rest of the world, in the US about 74.5 million people have some type of physical disability. That's over 20% of the population. Disabilities are not all congenital and appear or fade over time. Medical improvements in developed countries like the US mean we will live longer, with impairments from age and disease. This is going to become more pronounced over time. People like you and I can expect to spend an average of about 8 years. That's 11.5% of your life living with one or more disabilities. Of today's 20-year-olds, over 1 in 4 will become disabled before they retire. Disabled folks are successful. In business, for example, companies report employees with disabilities have better retention rates, reducing the high cost of turnover. Other American surveys reveal that after 1 year of employment, the retention rate of people with disabilities is 85%. In the US, people with disabilities have a higher rate of self-employment and small business experience than those without a declared disability. What sorts of disabilities are we talking about? Well, 30 million Americans still walk on their feet, but have trouble getting around and need a cane, walker, or helper for some tasks. 12 million need assistance with everyday tasks around the house in one way or another. Obvious disabilities, and the icon for much of this that even I use, people in wheelchairs, only 3.6 million Americans. For our purposes, a key disability is colorblindness. Someone you work with is probably colorblind per our definitions, because not everyone is red-green colorblind, and many people have reduced color vision, but aren't totally colorblind. We're sort of bad at defining this, but when you consider all those cases, it might be 20% of the population. But have you ever met a colorblind person with a pro-colorblindness t-shirt or bumper sticker, who had a handicapped license plate, or who didn't get a job due to it? Disability is not always a horrible impediment, and not always visible to you. it does matter when we design for a certain definition of normal that problems occur. Whether it's 12 or 20% of the population that has some sort of color deficit, that's on top of the 20% of conventional, obvious, and declared disabilities, like people in wheelchairs. I'm not going to review other low-grade physical or cognitive deficits and do the math, but it adds up. A lot of the population has a disability that we care about. And a lot of your users. So as I said up front, we're not entirely going to talk about designing for the disabled as some group of people who are not us, but designing for everyone. And I do mean everyone, even you. Robin Christofferson, a blind designer, discusses the concept of temporary disability. Not illness, like I mentioned before, but things like distraction or transient physical conditions that change how you work. When you're in the kitchen or the shop, do you ever have wet or dirty hands? When it's cold, you wear gloves. How do you use your phone or computer? Differently, maybe much more badly. There's even starting to become data about this available. People use their mobile phones all the time. You can see my presentation on touch for more information about this. They don't stop using their phone just because they're carrying groceries or a baby, but it does change how accurately they can tap. A lot, as you see in these charts here. Accounting for that means that people can use your product in more places and more people can use your product.
Microsoft, as part of their inclusive tools, which are otherwise worth checking out, has a lovely chart about levels of disability that I think says this better than I previously have. Disability is not a health condition, but when interactions mismatch. At a school for the deaf, the individual who doesn't sign is the disabled one. Your brain is tricky. Our input processor shares video and audio input. Paying too much attention to something visual, even just reading something on screen, you can literally not hear things. The human brain can only take in so much information. Roadway designers, for one, know that the faster you drive, the more you have to zero in on what's in front of you. Your brain can't process everything that's going on. So you can totally miss road signs, cross traffics, or pedestrians off to the side of the road. They work with a concept called the design speed of a roadway. I like that term. Designed for an expected amount of information being absorbed at once. What's the design speed of your website or app?
This is one reason I had to make this presentation. I sometimes get called out on accessibility standards. Especially on mobile, with glare and distraction and rain and carrying babies and groceries and riding on buses and everything, you have to design as though for colorblind, nearsighted people with muscle tremors. All my standards for normal design, on mobiles especially, assume all of this, so I often don't talk about design for accessibility as a specific topic area. If you make sure your design accommodates everyone's abilities, it works better for literally everyone all the time. However, accessibility is also a legal, regulatory, or contractual requirement a lot of the time. That was a crazy idea back in the 70s when the first laws began to be passed about providing accommodation for the disabled. The Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, which receive federal financial assistance in federal employment and in the employment practices of federal contractors. It immediately impacted a lot of companies. You build airplanes for the government? Now you have to provide for your workers per this law. The foundations of user experience are in human factors, and those principles, guidelines, and statistics were created originally by the U.S. military, especially Air Force and Navy aviation. Over time, as, for example, cockpits have gotten more advanced displays, they have of course kept in mind the principles to assure everyone can use them, right? No. They have tightened restrictions on who can get certain jobs. No one with any color vision deficit can be an aircrew. That green stripe of where you should fly your airplane could not be accidentally viewed as red. You can't use that principle for your customers. Not just because you missed the spending of 1 billion users, but legally. In 1998, Section 508 was added to the Rehabilitation Act. This means now you have to provide digital products that meet the same needs. If a government worker, or worker of a contractor, might use a digital system of any sort, those need to be able to be used regardless of any disability they may have. When a telecom, for example, wants to get a government contract, and I've worked on these, the website where they buy and manage the service has to comply with these principles strictly. More requirements apply to specific industries or specific technologies. The threat of lawsuits alone mean that if you have video, you better caption it. If you build for electronic health records, as some people I know do, then you have to meet federal requirements to make them have quality outcomes. The next stages of this require it to be usable and accessible as well. The CVAA is a very vague law, which can be interpreted to mean you need lots of accessibility in mobile devices. You may, but also can use it to prove your company must be accessible, or fear it being broadly interpreted, and a lawsuit. It's not just websites. If you knew this, great, but I find a lot of people who think Section 508 is a law about websites. It covers pretty much all electronic communications, from video and audio to telecom to computers and the internet. The principles are fairly universal. And one key principle is of comparable access. You don't have to offer the exact same thing, for obvious reasons. Let's say you offer video services, but the deaf cannot get the whole content as the audio component is missing to them. All you have to do is something to offer the same content, even if it's another format. That's what closed captions are for. The same basic content in any other, maybe slightly lower fidelity manner, may be a principle you are already familiar with from web design. Yes, it's the same thing as graceful degradation. When well done, you never remove content or functionality, just make it work in some other way. For the past couple decades, many businesses have lived by the exceptions allowed in the law. It even had vague provisions about undue hardship, but mostly by lack of comparable access. Until the modern smartphone era, there were pretty much no good, accessible mobile phones. They were simply therefore not provided to employees. Phone companies were disappointingly fine with this. That is no longer a thing. The world is changing, and increasingly, provisions for access by everyone are the law. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. It is similar in scope and power to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Unlike the Civil Rights Act, the ADA also requires most employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities and imposes accessibility requirements on public accommodations. Public accommodations seemed obvious back in the late 80s. Outdoor spaces, public roads and sidewalks, restaurants, stores, hospitals, and other places the public has reasonable access to. And look, adding ramps and curb cuts doesn't have to ruin the architecture, and also helps other people in their day-to-day lives. So again, accessible design is universal human design. But this has been a key sticking point as we move into the digital era. Although computers, and especially connected devices, have empowered everyone, but especially traditionally disenfranchised groups, rights in the internet have lagged behind as a matter of law and regulation. So in 2010, the National Association for the Deaf, after years of asking, begging, cajoling, and griping, ended up just suing Netflix over their policy of not offering subtitles. In 2012, it was settled, and they captioned all programming that they offer by the end of 2014. They even did things like added kill days to devices they couldn't easily update, so every Netflix experience is accessible, and I had to buy a new Blu-ray player. To add confusion, in April of this year, it was reversed in the Ninth Circuit Court. Regardless, others are getting federal lawsuits also. The U.S. Department of Justice has ruled that it totally applies to government agencies, and still has a statement that they are in the process of rulemaking for everyone else, so will clearly be bringing regulations to the forefront soon. I am sure there will be more court cases, but consider this a civil rights issue. It's not likely to go back, but missteps along the way notwithstanding, forward. Accessibility will be required, and there's no point in arguing about it. The U.S. Department of Justice has ruled that it totally applies to government agencies, and still has a statement that they are in the process of rulemaking for everyone else, so will clearly be bringing regulations to the forefront soon. I am sure there will be more court cases, but consider this a civil rights issue. It's not likely to go back, but missteps along the way notwithstanding, forward. Accessibility will be required, and there's no point in arguing about it. What are the accessible functions of your app, website, or other digital product? As I've discussed, there are lots of factors involved in this, but one of the things we all rely on as designers, not to mention humans, is vision. So let's turn on some accessibility mode functions on our phones for low vision users. If you want to see how this works, I'm going to show you an example now. It's only Android because the two platforms are really very similar now. Since it talks constantly, I won't be narrating during it, so note that I've turned on something in developer options, so the little gray circle is where my finger is actually touching the screen. Android's talkback settings highlight the selection with a green box. So if you see a little gray dot and then a green box around a button or a row or an icon, that's what's happening. Is I've tapped and it recognized that as a selection. That's what it's reading. I do go back and forth and hit the same items multiple annoying times, as I'm mostly doing this the right way with my eyes closed. I'm not very good at being blind, however. I do admit this is a bit long, but that's because I want to show you several types of controls. The native part of the phone itself, an application, a website, and several steps in the process so you understand the issues and sometimes good parts. You can fast forward or come back later if you want, but do be sure to understand how this works one way or the other.
YouTube. YouTube. Done. YouTube. Showing items 0 of 100. Showing items 2 to 4 of 46. Home button. Subscriptions button. Account button. Subscriptions button. Account button. Search. More options button. Search. Edit box. Currently editing. Search YouTube. K. K. Show I. T. T. T deleted. I deleted. D. R. T. T. T deleted. T. E. N. Search. Keyboard hidden. Navigate up. 2 minutes. Kitten and owl video becomes it. 3 minutes. 38 seconds. Surprise. 9 minutes. 24 seconds. Top 10 cutest kittens on YouTube. Lovely Kittens fans. 2 years ago 3M views. 9 minutes. 20. Showing item 1 of 43. Hide controls button. Pause video button. Top 10 cutest kittens on YouTube. 3,480,613 views. Like 14,879 others have liked this video. Dislike 1,081 others have 3 million. Lovely Kittens fans 6,846 subscribe. Cat finds most amazing 30-minute suggestions. Double tapped. Home button. Home. Chrome. Home. Chrome. CMI. MCD. Edit box. Search or type URL. Edit box. Search or type URL. Edit box. Showing URL keyboard. Hey, Amazon.com. Hey, showing items 1 to 5 of 5. Amazon.com. Online shopping for electronics. Showing text keyboard. Keyboard hidden. Showing text keyboard. Amazon Instant Video. Amazon Instant Video. Books. Books. Amazon Fire TV Family. Amazon Fire TV Family. Fire Tablets. Fire Tablets. Kindle. Kindle. Clothing, shoes and jewelry. Clothing, shoes and jewelry. Electronics. Electronics. Amazon Home Services. Amazon. Edit box. Edit box. Extra 15% off kit. Display women's athletic 18-300. Fire HD. Display with Amazon.com. Adidas Women's Vigor 5 Trail Running Shoe by Adidas $47.39, $84.99. Amazon Prime. Some sizes, colors are Adidas Women's Vigor 5 TR. Ref equals Adidas Women's Vigor. Size. Select size. Adidas Women's Vigor 5 TRW Trail 47. Add to cart button. Add to wish list. Twitter. Adidas, frequently bought, ref equals CT. About this item, description mesh up, features and details. Double tap to select. Features and details. Double tap to select. Show features. Imported, synthetic, imported, NA. Synthetic sole, lace-up running shoe, lightly packed rear pull loop, shock-absorbing EVA mids, ADI product details, department, manufacturer, Adidas running footwear. Manufacturer reference, D689, product dimension, shipping weight, home button. Overview. Recordable free.
I hope you noted how some things are gibberish, like the way they coded the YouTube tab bar. Some things are tedious and useless, like counts of views or details of some of the products. But some things are easier, as ambiguous icons are replaced with perfectly reasonable names describing what the function does. If you haven't done this before, I encourage you to try it yourself. Try it on anything, but at least in part, try to make it something you worked on, so you're extra horrified by what you've done. Website or an app, it doesn't matter. Open it up, close your eyes, and try it. I'm going to assume you all have a smartphone. I suggest you grab some headsets so you can do this more easily without bugging your wife, the cat, or everyone else in the office. For Android, go to Settings, find an Accessibility section, and tap it. There are lots of features, but what you're looking for here is Talkback. This changes the entire way touch works. You drag or tap around to find out what is on the screen. Two-finger gestures scroll the window, by the way. Once you've tapped something, it remains in focus. If you double tap anywhere on the screen, you can select it. Unusual interactions are often described, so at least when you start out with the voice being fairly slow, wait for everything to be read before you move on, so you don't get confused or lost. iOS works much the same way. To get to it, go to Settings, General, Accessibility. As before, the whole touch interaction mode will change. Drag your finger around or tap to hear what's under it. Double tap anywhere to select that last item read. If you have a BlackBerry or Windows phone, sorry, it has under 2% installed base and dropping, so I didn't bring those recommendations how to get into the thing, but they do have the same features. So figure out how to get into it and try it on yours as well. When you're in there, you'll notice many other accessibility features. Try them all out sometime to see what happens to your app or your website. Is it broken? We'll talk about a few more of those pitfalls as we move forward later. Do remember to close your eyes. It's actually kind of hard to use because of the way it changes modes if you're trying to watch and listen at the same time, but also we're trying to simulate what a low vision or blind person experiences. So close your eyes, move your finger on the screen, and remember how it works. Don't forget your two-finger scroll, otherwise you can't scroll the page. Remember, one finger doesn't scroll anymore, it just explores stuff. Don't just play around with it, but try to perform an actual task, preferably one you would normally do. Read up on the news, the latest sports scores, try to find a product you were going to buy. See how it makes sense for you. Can you actually get the information or perform a task? Do labels make sense? Are there labels? I find a lot of apps and websites use the wrong components, then don't label them, so there's nothing read useful, or something nonsensical like button. Is the information in a sensible order? When you find something, can you predict what's below it? You are, I will add, going to find things wrong. This list here is the kind of things found by someone who surveyed a bunch of bank sites. Yes, thousands of problems. Not thousands of individual users, but thousands of problems on an individual site. That's how bad it can be. Which might lead you to ask, though, how'd they get to that? What is the definition of accessibility that lets them lead to those high counts of problems? And like that list I showed you, you can hire people to come in and do compliance checks. They will give you a report like that based on these sorts of checklists up here. This one is from Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act itself. But note they're checkpoints. They're kind of like QA things. They aren't a specification. They don't say how to get there. See number 1.2, for example. It doesn't actually say to use alt tags. It just says something like them. If you only do a classic compliance check, then first of all, by the time you get one of these done, it's too late to fix it. So let's talk mostly instead about planning design for accessibility, and some key tactics that'll let you design better products. WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from the Web Accessibility Initiative, a working group within the W3C, which I hope you've heard of, at least that last one. They have much better guidelines, which are more tactical and usable, but also very, very web-oriented. And sadly, this means the desktop web. They assume everyone has a computer sitting on a desk with a keyboard and a pointing device. In fact, more people have smartphones than computers, and due to the cost and complexity of things like screen readers, those with vision problems are gravitating to mobile devices over computers. So even for the web, if you only design websites, use these very carefully. Myself, I've got an even smaller list of core principles that try to be more about, well, principles, strategy, and design than interface and code. I say content first, last, and always. Write your code as though people will look at it, because they really are. Design structures to support your content before you worry about pixels and color. For the web, use Aria roles when basic types don't cut it. Embrace comparable access, but not blindly. Alt tags can bite you. Make sure the function is as clear as the content, and it is clear in all contexts. Be able to set aside color to make sure contrast is what's helping you. And assure your whole product works on all devices with all plugins for scale, size, and zoom. Content first is actually a bit of a buzzword in certain UX design circles now, but it shouldn't need to be a buzzword. If you aren't starting with content, why are you bothering with architecture, color, spacing, or really your whole product? But in accessibility, content is all. Function too, sure, but think back to what was confusing about accessibility modes. Labels on buttons, lists, and forms. You can't take action without information. Information is content. Let's look at a really info-dense place, like a news site. CNN starts right in with a title, and so on, bringing you straight into the article. Easy. We know that Turkish warplanes have bombed ISIS. Well coded, the markup appears to all be the same. The title is text, so it can be read easily. There's very little junk in the article in the way, just a single link to the video, which is great. Maybe you want to watch or listen to it. Then the article text itself, all with properly semantic use of subtitles, paragraphs, and so on. Reasonably easy to read in pretty much any format. This stuff is also easy to scan by bots, so your SEO values tend to be better than more well-formed and more well-designed your content is. You can use that as an excuse to pay for accessibility if you're very careful with your arguments. But the article turns out to still be unreadable, as it's way down here. The rest of the page is occupied with navigation, every single frame and caption of a long slideshow that's just kind of sitting there on the side and you ignore it in normal mode. It's very hard to read the article at all, with style sheets off, and almost impossible if you were using a screen reader that had to scan all this content. If you're wondering how to remove style sheets, there are many style sheet removers. There's one I use for Chrome that I particularly like that's bookmarked in here, so you can look at the notes to get a link to it. They also let you do things like turn off images, so you can check your alt tags and so forth. The US government, due to the compliance needs we talked about, has pretty good websites. The article from this page at the CDC is pretty far down, past the navigation and so on like before, but the very, very first thing on the page is links to the search, the navigation, and the content itself. This is a good solution. I call the practice of organizing information in the page information design. Some other people do too, but not everybody. It's considered then the next level down from information architecture. You form the structure and flow of your app, your site, your product, then the structure and flow of each page or view. A well-designed, well-coded page will not just lead the eye down the page, but present the key info first. You can use coding tricks to make this work well, placing navigation at the end, then using CSS to put it up top. A link at the top should be there to jump the user to the navigation. But do you really think anyone using a screen reader will use anything on your site if they have to wade through the whole sitemap first? Make sure you provide jump links or some other solution so that people aren't wading through long lists or even long articles to get to the right place on your site. You can also find good information on this by looking up semantic markup. Semantics is just a nerd term for meaning, and here is the principle of matching content to a type of code. Titles, for example, should never be a paragraph tag with styles to make them bigger, but on the web an H1 so it is intrinsically a title. It can be found, read, sized, etc. the right way, by computers, computer interpreters like websites and screen readers, and therefore by people. Know what codes mean. Never use italics on the web, but use EM for emphasis. It defaults to displaying italics, but it means emphasis, so is read differently by people and screen readers, just like I'm reading things with different emphasis right now. There are a lot of different bits of markup in HTML, and importantly, similar stuff on apps. So don't forget those either. For any content, whatever platform you're putting it on, be sure to find the right element for type for your content. Comparable access can be a lot of things, but an easy to understand one is closed captions, like we already talked about twice, and also alt text, as I've implied. Now use this carefully. I say you must leave out alt text if your image is purely decorative, not content-bearing, or is covered elsewhere. Like here, is it really helpful if the alt text is the same as the actual caption immediately next to it? No. These images could be described differently and more complexly, I'll bet. There's lots of information in a photo, as we know. Title tags are another problem. I, and many people I know, have been told for years they're useful for screen readers to add context. It turns out not so. Most readers ignore them. The best way instead to make a link accessible is to make the anchor text relevant and descriptive. Even the W3C suggests ways to turn an irrelevant click here link into a contextual link for readers and so forth, but I say even for sighted users, your best is to make it simple. Nobody thinks click here is a good idea for a label. People in real life glance at things, so lose context all the time anyway. No hacks are needed. Aria is another standard from the WAI group or the W3C. It's a way to make web technologies more accessible to people with disabilities. It adds little tags to the HTML, but isn't needed for boring old semantic web stuff. There are implicit Aria tags in those semantic web tags. A button is a button, so you don't need to add the Aria role saying it's a button again. You can, but it's just a waste of time. Aria helps with dynamic content and other advanced user interface controls developed with Ajax, HTML, JavaScript, and so on. This is useful with certain web apps, and as we now use new dynamic technologies. The piece of code you're looking at here presents errors in a form submission in line. So instead of pressing submit and then it throws back an error and you have to wade through it and figure it out, you can offer accessible inline error messaging that says, whoops, your password's too short or that username is taken. If you code them right, even advanced features can be completely accessible. Don't let anything become cryptic when any other one thing fails. Here on, shockingly, a Good Web Design Awards page, the only indication that the link goes to a remote site is the icon. Actually, as you notice, when the style sheets are on, the only indication it's a link is when you hover around the page and notice that it's a clickable item. It isn't underlined otherwise. So that little up right arrow, I didn't know what that meant at first, and images don't always load. It's supposed to be at the end of the line, which does help when you see it that way, but they coded it badly so it can wrap to the next line. Make sure everything works well, clearly, and unambiguously. Then make sure it's coded to work as you designed and intended it for every user. The one most important thing to make type readable to most users, at least those with at least some vision, is to make sure it has the right contrast ratio. This is not a single number, but varies by the size of the type. Larger text needs less contrast for complex reasons having to do with what's called, well, the resolution and a concept called the smallest perceptible difference. When you look at recommendations, you're going to find most people say to use WCAG level AA. I guess A is no longer done. I, however, don't. Level AAA requires a contrast ratio of 7:1 for normal text and 4.5:1 for large text. I suggest this. Partially because black on white, which I try to use whenever possible, is 23:1 contrast. I don't think 7:1 and 4.5:1 are particularly arduous, so always go with the AAA requirements. Other research and other guidelines by other organizations imply the same thing. We need a bunch of contrast based on weird lighting conditions, glare, vision deficits, tinted glasses, whatever. So, high contrast is best whenever you can possibly get away with it. Colorblindness, as shown here for 4 of the main types that exist, is only about the hue of a color. When you check suitability of 2 colors by contrast, it doesn't matter what color it is. Contrast is something else. Note, say, the lower left box in each of these. It's supposed to be white text on red. Whether it appears green or brownish red or another green or red, it has a 9.18 to 1 contrast ratio. That, you'll notice, is better than 7 to 1, so it's very readable no matter how it's perceived, colorblind or not, yellow glasses or not. So you can design in grayscale and check for your colors before settling on them and actually getting to the design details. Even for color vision users, understanding how color vision works can help you make your product more readable. Say you want to have a warning message, so you pick a bright red icon. Well, there's sort of no such thing as bright red. The luminous efficacy and the eye sensitivity function of red is lower than orange or yellow or green. This is why contrast is based on color or hue, not just the intensity or brightness. I call this chromatic brightness, but I totally made that up and it's slightly inaccurate. The point still holds though. Not all colors are equally bright, so if you want to get someone's attention, yellow on black will work a lot better than, say, red on black. Whether the highest contrast color fits in the messaging scheme by meaning is something else, of course. People very often do not admit they're disabled. Especially for temporary or changing conditions, illnesses, or aging, people are not well at handling this. Try to make your product work as much as possible without accessibility features in the browser and OS. Let's look a little at designing the structure of your product. Say you have a function like a dialog box. This is very simple. We can't mess this up, right? It's not bad. It says what it wants, uninstall updates, explains it briefly, okay, cancel, okay. But say you have a zooming monitor, like a couple slides ago, or a mobile screen reader where your finger is hovering it alone. If you don't remember or have a cognitive problem, it makes it harder to connect concepts. Or you're simply distracted or busy and glancing. Then this. Wouldn't uninstall instead of OK be a little bit better? Yes, for everyone. That would be a better design. If you pay attention to every guideline for good design, it would say that to you. It's accessible, but it's also good design for everyone. Did you know a lot of people have what are called vestibular disorders? They, and people with epilepsy and other conditions, can get dizzy or worse when seeing certain patterns or movements. A current trend, especially what iOS does by default with animation and transparency, is a serious problem for many of these people. You should then avoid large areas of movement, parallax effect. For many people, they simulate 3D space, but for others, with 2 different movement rates, cause issues. And avoid side-scrolling, or items flying in when scrolling down. Make sure your controls map correctly to actions. Do give the user control, so they can pause or stop any movement, if you have animations or parallax effects running automatically. Like everything, make sure there's a reason your animation exists and it communicates content and control to the user. Now, iOS, it must be said, does give user control at the OS level to reduce or remove parallax and other animations. People probably won't customize your individual app or site, so think hard about what you include by default and try to respect OS level controls. So if people have turned it off for their phone, they turn it off in your app also. Did you know a lot of people have what are called vestibular disorders? They, and people with epilepsy and other conditions, can get dizzy or worse when seeing certain patterns or movements. A current trend, especially what iOS does by default with animation and transparency, is a serious problem for many of these people. You should then avoid large areas of movement, parallax effect. For many people, they simulate 3D space, but for others, with two different movement rates, cause issues. And avoid side scrolling, or items flying in when scrolling down. Make sure your controls map correctly to actions. Do give the user control so they can pause or stop any movement if you have animations or parallax effects running automatically. Like everything, make sure there's a reason your animation exists and it communicates content and control to the user. Now, iOS, it must be said, does give user control at the OS level to reduce or remove parallax and other animations. People probably won't customize your individual app or site, so think hard about what you include by default and try to respect OS level controls. So if people have turned it off for their phone, they turn it off in your app also. Once you've built your product in an accessible, universally usable manner, you have to test it, monitor it, react, and be able to prove it. Perform expert reviews throughout the design process and conduct usability tests at the end of key phases. You hopefully already do this, but now we're going to add on key accessibility attributes to check for. I like ethnography a lot. That's just the practice of observational research. Instead of having users into your lab or asking them questions, you go to their homes or offices and watch the way they perform their daily tasks. This guy would be recorded as a desktop PC user on any analytics tool, and if you made him fill out a survey, he'd probably say the same. But he's standing. And behind him is a truck repair shop. He wears eye protection and earplugs. This is not a traditional desktop experience. The only way to find that is to get out and see how your users, disabled, distracted, or otherwise, actually work with your systems. You will need to use other techniques and careful expert evaluation for apps, other types of documents, most multimedia content, and so on. But if you just run a website, there are many, many tools you can use to automatically check for compliance. The best of these are very much like setting up automated system tests. You aren't just going to give it the URL and tell it to give you a report, but they require some time and effort to actually set up the test process. You need to watch and listen on an ongoing basis for the entire life cycle of the project. You have to account for change and let the community provide feedback. You're going to make changes to it, bug fixes, improvements, and so forth, and the world changes around you. You can't rely on browsers, OS versions, or user behavior staying the same, so need to check back constantly. Customers may have different equipment or needs than you're used to, so they end up being your largest testing cadre. Have a method to find and fix bugs based on customer care feedback. Too often, customer care and development are so separated that there's no connection, but add a way for care to report bugs. Don't leave it there with customers. Known bugs with workarounds, generally or for specific accessibility problems, need to make it back to the customer care knowledge base so users can be helped. Helping them once on email or the phone is fine, solving their issue, making their deposit, changing their phone plan. Letting them help themselves afterwards by telling them the workaround is better. Not as good as fixing your site, but it could be months before you fix it. Tell them how to work around it. I tend to say this is part of DevOps. Give them the ability to link customer service channels with development and repair. They're good at handling issues like this if you empower them. Write it all down. From design principles and decisions on down, record everything as a process you undertake for the organization, the product, the project, and as an ongoing effort. Record the compliance with your own plan to prove you actually carried it out. Try to link back all the points you've made to law, regulation, or best practice so you can demonstrate, if something goes badly and lawyers start calling you to prove it, that you've made a deliberate, organized, and concerted effort to meet the federal guidelines. It's probably best to designate a compliance person, or a compliance group if you have a big enough organization and enough of these. I have been unimpressed by professional accessibility certification vendors, mostly because there's no good central clearinghouse that certifies them. I say, if you can design a website, you can also build for accessibility, and as long as you actually carry out these tasks, you can certify it internally. So, in the end, even if you have no morals, you should provide accommodation to every user just because it's a huge and productive part of the population. You can make money off this underserved segment. Even if you're not yet sure your digital assets are a public accommodation, wait a little while. It's going that way, and you will. It's time to make your products accessible today. We have guidelines for accessible design now, but many of the core principles lead to better work and making your digital products work for every one of your users all the time. Since there's a legal requirement, or at least a chance of lawsuits, you should prove this. Include accessibility in your user tests, your analytics, your customer feedback. Be ready to fix problems and address their needs immediately through other channels. And write it all down. Make a plan. Record your methods, record your actions, follow everything scrupulously so you can prove it. If you have any questions, first download the PowerPoint deck. Many slides have links or articles or videos explaining in more detail. Just look in the speaker notes. At the end of many of the pages, there's a link you can follow. Also, I more or less read the deck, so if you didn't understand what I was trying to say, try reading the printed words, and that might make sense instead. But if you still have questions, feel free to ask me. I'm happy to help with anything you need.